Hi guys, I'm just another guy named James, and today I'm going to be talking about Superman. And today I'm going to be talking about the Superman story, kind of generally referred to as Superman Gangbuster. And this story kind of chronicles Superman's various confrontations with the vigilante known as Gangbuster. And yeah, so this story is it's really just basically a sequel to the Supergirl saga, which was written and drawn by John Byrne and Jerry Ordway. This one is missing John Byrne's credit, but it still has Jerry Ordway. Jerry Ordway was a writer and artist who worked on Superman, on one of the two Superman titles that this story runs through. The other title was written by Roger Stern and drawn by Kerry Gammill and inked by John Beatty. But yeah, so that's kind of your creative teams that you're looking at for this story. And this story is pretty good, honestly. It's very solid. It's kind of long. It goes through these 4 issues, that issue back there, like 5 more down there. It's a long story and there's a lot going on in it. And what's nice, and it's kind of nice. There's a lot of Superman characters that are kind of gonna be that you might want to be aware of, though. So I'm gonna briefly recap a little bit of Superman history. So first things first, I would highly, highly, highly recommend checking out my video on Superman the Supergirl saga. It'll be linked down in the description. I highly recommend checking that out before you watch this video. Just because, like I said, this story is very much so a sequel to that, and it has a lot in and of that story that becomes important later on. But yeah, so that's one thing. Highly recommend. But I'll give you a Cliff Notes version. Superman basically gets sent to an alternate universe, and while he's there, he is forced to kill 3 Kryptonian super criminals. And this is notable because Superman obviously doesn't kill people. But yeah, okay, so that's one thing that's going on into this story. Another thing that's probably worth noting, Brainiac at this time in the comics is not at all who you are going to be thinking of. Because when I say Brainiac, you probably think, the robot who, like digitizes all information on various planets and then destroys them. Yeah, that's not Brainiac in this era of Superman. In this era of Superman, Brainiac is instead he's like an alien consciousness that's taking over a human body that has like psychic powers. It's really odd, honestly. But yeah, that's something that to be made aware of. Yeah, there's just a lot of odd odds and ends going on. And another thing to note, the story that we're talking about today will eventually cross over with the Invasion DC Comics event, but I didn't read Invasion, so I'm not really going to be talking about it too much. But yeah, let's see. Is there anything else that needs? Oh, there's probably the two other characters that you need to be aware of, are the 2 right here on this cover, Gangbuster and Guardian. So Guardian was at this time basically he's the head of security for Project Cadmus, which is like a DNA extraction, cloning, like DNA modification company, basically. And he's an old ally of Superman's, and he's also he's basically just another hero who operates out of Metropolis. And then Gangbuster was at first a vigilante in Metropolis, whose identity was revealed in an earlier Superman story to be this guy named Jose Delgado. But Jose Delgado was actually massively injured while fighting a villain, like Lex Luthor robot, and he's actually currently crippled. So going into this, there is probably that you can know that there's going to be a bit of a mystery going on. But yeah, let's see, Guardian, Gangbuster, Brainiac. This story is very much so of the Superman world. So, like, obviously, there's going to be Ma and Pa Kent. There's going to be Jimmy Olsen and Lois Lane and Perry White. But yeah, but I kind of just wanted to give a brief recap on some of those characters who are just a bit odd or who you might not know in general. But yeah, this is where our story. This is where we're going to hop into our story, which begins with an article about a homeless man being abducted by a very sharply dressed man from the streets of Metropolis. An article which is being written by the homeless man's friend, Jimmy Olsen. But the Daily Planet's editor, Perry White, isn't impressed, and he has Jimmy go to the police station to check for more information on the case. At the station, we see an officer let Jimmy know that they found his friend's body, and that his friend left a drawing of the man who took him, depicting a man in a tuxedo and a top hat. We then cut to a slum in Metropolis, where we see that that oddly human and yet oddly alien Brainiac has been kidnapping homeless people and stealing their spinal fluid to allow him to fully take over his host body. But we see that strategy isn't working. So Brainiac decides to put on his hat and tails and steal some brains to use in his experiments. We then cut to Jose Delgado, who was formerly the vigilante known as Gangbuster, before he was paralyzed in action trying to save Lois Lane's life. And one of Jose's friends is also there trying to convince him to go on a date with Lois Lane. But Jose refuses, saying he isn't going out until he can walk out on his own 2 feet. But at the same time, Jose receives a phone call from a medical institution who tell him that they can make him walk again. But we see that Lex Luthor is secretly pulling the strings. We also see that Lois has arrived at Jose's apartment. We then cut to Superman, who is sitting in his room in his bedroom in Smallville, trying to come to grips with the fact that he killed off General Zod and the other rogue Kryptonians on Counter-Earth. We then cut to a bar where we see Cat Grant, a recurring side character and writer at the Daily Planet, getting drunk in a bar before she walks out into the street. And as soon as Cat gets on the street, Brainiac charges in and grabs her and throws her in a taxi. Jimmy Olsen, who is walking down the same street, sees the whole thing and goes chasing after her. But he is also soon captured by Brainiac. We then cut back to Superman, who is now flying through Metropolis until he hears the electronic signal in Jimmy's watch going off. So he flies off to Brainiac's hideout. And the two have a quick battle that eventually boils down to a psychic battle, until Superman, through sheer force of his anger, is able to beat Brainiac, and who is then carted off to prison. We then jump to the past, to Clark's childhood, and we see a time when he and Lana Lang were running around the playground as little kids, until they get in trouble with their teacher. And after getting them in trouble, Clark curses the teacher, saying that he wished she was dead. We then jump ahead a little bit to Pa Kent and Clark at the teacher's funeral. But as Clark approaches the casket, the teacher isn't there, and she's been replaced by General Zod. And Superman is suddenly an adult, and Superman's nightmare continues, as ghostly apparitions appear to Clark. So he tries to fight them off, but all he does is trash his apartment. We then cut to Jose Delgado, who is going to see a doctor about an experimental treatment for his legs. We then jump to Morgan Edge, who is a corrupt media mogul who is also working for Inner Yang, a terrorist group in the Superman comics at this time, who is leaking information to a recent mob informant on a weapons shipment, on a shipment of LexCorp weapons that he can steal. We then cut into the Daily Planet, where we see Perry giving Clark a reporting assignment and sending him into the field, but then telling him that once Clark's done on the assignment, he has to go home because Clark is so far out of it. We then see that as Clark is heading out of out for his assignment, a group of 4 men cause a rock slide with a remote explosive so that they can loot a truck that is just driven through a tunnel. Before we see what happens there, we cut to Jose Delgado, who is hooked up to a machine that is enabling him to walk by stimulating the muscles necessary to walk electrically. We then once again see that Delgado's operations are being observed by Lex Luthor. We then cut back to Clark, who has been caught in the traffic created by the rock slide that the thugs use to isolate their cargo. And we see that Superman flies out of the taxi to clear the rock slide, but Superman is distracted by the truck, which now has a force field surrounding it. The force field is taken down when 3 of the goons come busting out in LexCorp power suits. And after a couple of minutes of dodging punches, Superman disables the suits and turns in the perps to the police, who tell Superman that there was a 4th crook who stole some weapons out of the truck. So Superman flies off and leaves the rest to the cops, who notice that Superman seems to be more gentle than usual. We then take a hard cut to later that night, where we see a vigilante kicking butt and demanding answers in the factory that the truck came from. And the only piece of information we learn is that the truck was fully owned and operated by Lex Luthor. The next day, in the Daily Planet newsroom, Perry calls Lois and Clark to the office and demands to know why his best reporters missed the return of Gangbuster. We then cut to Lois Lane, who is trying to find Jose Delgado to see if he knows anything about the new Gangbuster. But Jose says he doesn't know, and he shows off his newly regained ability to walk. We then cut to a scene in a mental hospital where a group of scientists are attempting to operate on Brainiac and remove a tumor from his head, all under the financial grace of Lex Luthor. We then transition to a press conference where we see Clark asking Luthor some hard questions before Luthor dodges them. Clark then notices a man pushing his way through the crowd using his X-ray vision, and he sees that the man is carrying a gun. Clark recognizes the man as Max Carter, the mob informant who led the truck heist earlier. So just as Carter is about to shoot Luthor, Clark stops him, but the shot goes wild and causes the roof to cave in, and in the scramble to escape, Carter comes face to face with Luthor, but Lex lets him go. We then cut back to Lois and Delgado, who are brought into the police station for questioning on Gangbuster. We then cut to LexCorp, where we see Luthor explaining to an assistant of his that he had to let Carter run away because Carter worked for Luthor and could implicate him in his crimes. What takes Luthor slightly longer to deduce is why Carter would try to kill him. But Luthor eventually decides it's because of Morgan Edge and Intergang. Morgan Edge is the same guy who leaked the information about the truck in the first place. We then cut to a bar where we see Gangbuster roughing up some patrons for information. But the info eventually pays off, and Gangbuster finds Carter, and he presses him for information on the shipment that he tried stealing, and Carter implicates Morgan Edge and Intergang. But just then, a cop comes by Carter's door, so Gangbuster runs out. We then see that the cop was actually an assassin of Lex Luthor's, so the assassin steals Carter's gun and kills him, but the gun backfires and the assassin is badly burned. We then cut outside and we see a real cop see Gangbuster running out of Carter's apartment, but Gangbuster gets away. Gangbuster is then deemed a suspect in the murder of Carter, and Superman turns much more of his attention to catching Gangbuster. We then cut back to Lex Luthor, who is waking up Brainiac and explaining to him that he installed bionic circuitry into Brainiac's mind that allows Lex to control or even kill Brainiac if he gets out of line, as they work together to kill Superman. We then cut to Clark, who is asleep at his desk at the Daily Planet, until he's woken up by a coworker. Then suddenly Lex Luthor comes in, proclaiming Clark to be Superman, and even opening fire on Clark. And this causes the death of several innocents, so Superman simply grabs Luthor and pops his head off, and melts down his goons in their power armor. Then Clark is woken up again, and he has a similar interaction with Brainiac. But instead of Brainiac killing his friends, Clark kills his friends. And then, before Clark is woken up for a third time, and upon this third awakening, Clark flies away to keep everyone around him safe. But Superman also believes that Brainiac is the one responsible for his nightmares. We then cut to Brainiac and learn that he is responsible for the nightmares, but that he has a plan for when Superman comes to confront him. We then see Brainiac enact the plan to fool Superman, but he can't help, slipping in a jab at Superman, which seems to lead to a knockdown, drag-out fight until Brainiac suddenly takes a dive, combusting into flames and seemingly dying. But later we see that he tricked Superman and is now working with Lex Luthor again. We then cut ahead about a week and we see Superman trying to talk a man off of a ledge. And as the man tells Superman the story of his life, we learn that this man is the same one who killed Max Carter and stole his gun. And that's actually why he's killing himself, because he feels so badly about the state of his life that he wants to just give up on it. And Superman is, like I said, he's trying to talk him out, but he's trying to stop the Hitman from taking his own life. But he eventually just leaves him to make the decision for himself. We then cut down to Lois Lane's apartment, where we see Jose Delgado come walking up to the door holding a bouquet of flowers. So the two can go out, but Lois is called to the scene with the jumper so she can get the story. And Superman leaving this guy up on the ledge is just another sign that Superman's kind of taking it easy on criminals right now. And with all those nightmares he's been having, his psyche is not in a good place. He's having nightmares. He's taking it easy on criminals, and it kind of leads you to want to ask what is going on with Superman and what's going to happen. And we then see what happens when Gangbuster arrives on the scene, grabs the Hitman, and jumps off the building with him, and they go careening down into the street until Gangbuster grabs a rope and starts swinging him around the city to scare him straight. But he leaves the Hitman, who is crawling back into the building, with some chilling words, saying, "Not so fast. I'm not through yet. I want to leave you with this thought. I hope after all of this, you do decide to jump. Just do it for the right reasons. Do it for all the victims, all of the lives you've destroyed in this pathetic existence of yours. But do not jump because you think fate dealt you a lousy hand." Then Gangbuster just swings off. Down on the street, Clark runs into Lois and Delgado, but Lois has to run back to the planet. So Clark and Delgado talk for a brief moment, and Delgado basically just tells Clark that he isn't Gangbuster. We then cut to Clark's apartment, where he is watching TV, but eventually he flies off to track down Gangbuster. Superman then notices a jewelry store that has been broken into, but the burglars had already been violently subdued by Gangbuster. We then cut to a new morning, where we see that someone has been murdered in what's being described as a voodoo murder, because the victim has been found has a series of similar victims who have all been found with voodoo dolls near them. We then see Superman flying around the city, and he flies to the Daily Planet, where he's planning to investigate these voodoo killings. We also see that Clark is fairly regular being very fatigued, which he chalks up to his recent battles with Brainiac. We then cut to a brief introduction to the idea that Invasion, DC's crossover of the year, has begun. So various groups of aliens are actively trying to conquer Earth. Then in the streets of Metropolis, we see a bunch of Thanagarians flying around, so Superman jumps into action to try to take them down. But as Superman is starting to fight them, he is attacked by the Voodoo Killer, who does a real number on him, sending him down to the street, through the street into the sewers. About an hour later, we see Captain Atom come come flying in to look for Superman, who's been missing in action since the attack. Adam goes down to the sewer where he finds Guardian, who is also looking for Superman. So the two join forces. We then cut to a seedy dive bar where Gangbuster shows up and starts strong-arming an informant for info on the Voodoo Killer. We see that Gangbuster definitely has some kind of enhanced ability as he tanks like a chair shattering on his back, and he tosses two of the other lowlifes trying to protect the informant. So we see the informant break and tell Gangbuster where to find the Voodoo Killer. So Gangbuster kicks down the door and confronts the Voodoo Killer and makes short work of him, seemingly being able to resist all of his spells, power through them. So after the fight's done, Gangbuster takes Voodoo and leaves him for the police to deal with. We then cut to later that night where we see that Superman is still missing. We then cut to Guardian, who is driving around in his battle van searching for Superman. But he instead finds Gangbuster, who is about to kill or very seriously maim a petty criminal. So Guardian uses some of the weapons on his battle van to try to stun Gangbuster. But it barely works and the two begin a fistfight. And we see that the Newsboy Legion, a group of kids who work with Guardian, are watching the fight and they want to help Guardian. But we then cut away and we see Jimmy Olsen is looking for Superman. And he's found himself in a dive bar surrounded by ruffians who are trying to rob him. So Jimmy tries once again to use his signal watch to call Superman. Back with Gangbuster and Guardian, we see that the Newsboys have gotten into the battle van and are driving straight for Gangbuster and Guardian. So Gangbuster pushes Guardian away at the last minute and he just tanks the hit from the battle van, which sends himself and the van into the bay. Guardian then dives in after the van to try to get the Newsboys out, but he's electrocuted by the van's defense systems and knocked out. We then see Superman lift the van and Guardian out of the water, but Gangbuster is nowhere to be found. Superman, who has just woken up from his injuries from the Hawk people and the Voodoo Killer, remembers that there's an invasion happening. And at the same time, he hears Jimmy's signal watch, so he goes off to save him. And after Superman saves Jimmy, he finds Captain Atom, who gives Superman the message that the aliens have agreed to a summit with Superman. But this is where we start getting into straight-up invasion crossovers, so we'll save that for another day. But our story does continue as we cut back to the Daily Planet, where Clark gives his story about the invasion to Perry White, but Clark is sent home because of how exhausted he looks. At his apartment, Clark tries to shave, but he ends up cutting himself, again because of how tired he is. So he sits down to watch the news in his chair, but he falls asleep. We then cut to LexCorp, where we see Gangbuster come crashing in through a window to confront Lex Luthor. And he starts tossing around Luthor's guards before he blocks the door to attack Luthor. But before Gangbuster can attack Luthor, Brainiac tries using his psychic powers to take down Gangbuster. But Gangbuster is able to fight off the psychic attack and take down Brainiac before jumping out of the window and swinging away. Luthor then calls the police and Gangbuster goes swinging through the building, ending up with a group of cops on the ground level. And he thinks about attacking them, but he doesn't. And he seems very dazed and confused. So he sneaks out of the building and he runs off to some other rooftop where he's confronted by the Guardian. And the two fight for a little bit, but eventually Gangbuster knocks Guardian off the building, and Gangbuster takes a dive into a dumpster. And even after a headfirst dive 7 stories down into a dumpster, Gangbuster is still coming out swinging at Guardian. So Guardian slashes Gangbuster with his shield, and Guardian seems pretty shocked by what he's seeing. Then the camera pans around, and we see that Gangbuster's uniform has been torn, only to reveal Superman's shield underneath. And as Gangbuster takes off his helmet, Clark Kent is incredibly confused about what's been happening, not wanting to believe that he could be Gangbuster, that Superman could be Gangbuster. So he flies away, and Superman flies off to his friend, Professor Hamilton's residence, and he borrows something, an invention of the professor's, a breathing apparatus. Then Superman calls the Daily Planet, telling them that he is going off to do an expose on some random on Intergang, and that he's going to be mailing in his stories for a while. Then Superman flies to Smallville to see his parents, to give them a bunch of letters to send to the Daily Planet to be his news stories, and most of all, to tell them why he's leaving. He's leaving Earth because he can no longer trust himself, because someone as powerful as he is, leading a double life and not knowing it, not knowing what happens when he's asleep, going out into the streets hurting people, nearly killing people. Superman, that's not a risk Superman can allow to happen anymore. That's not something that Superman can let happen. He can't risk it anymore. And he can't risk anyone getting hurt because he loses control. So he hugs his parents, tells them goodbye, and he flies away, exiling himself from Earth. And for today, that's where the story ends. So Superman. So basically, long story short, Superman is Gangbuster. Is Gangbuster 2, I guess, because Jose Delgado was the first one. But Superman's Gangbuster 2. And it's this really, and this is a story that I actually really enjoyed while I was reading it. I wasn't planning on reading this whole story all at once, but it kind of ended up happening that way. Just because it was really good. You know, I was reading it issue to issue. I was intrigued by what would happen next. And it was just really good. The artwork in these issues is really good. Even the pencils by Jerry Ordway, who I don't always love as a penciler, really came alive in these issues. Like, look at that cover, that kick. That's pretty solid. And Jerry Ordway's art I do sometimes find to be stiff. But you'll see it, especially in this issue where with the guy wanting to kill himself. You get a lot of really good dynamic angles of Gangbuster swinging around. It's a really compelling story. And I knew the twist when I started reading it. I knew that the big reveal was going to be that Gangbuster was Superman. And that obviously affects the way you read the story when you know the twist. But yeah, it's a really good story, honestly. It's solidly written so that you can kind of start piecing together that Gangbuster might be Superman. And what's cool is you do eventually see that you see throughout the story the psychic toll on Superman. And that's where I really like the story. It's a character study on Clark Kent's Superman. Because at the end of the day, Clark is who he is, and Superman's who he pretends to be. And that's the dynamic that makes this era of Superman so unique and works so well. So this story was really good. Clark is so affected by what he did on Counter-Earth by executing General Zod and the other Kryptonians that it takes a real psychic toll. He has to be at his home in his Smallville for a time. And then he's able to continue being Superman, but it's clearly affecting him. Like the issue with his nightmares. Brainiac's inducing the nightmares, but Brainiac isn't controlling what he sees. So Clark is very clearly afraid of losing control, of killing his enemies, because it would make him what they are. It's a really cool story for that. And then another cool element that I like about the story, beyond just Clark's psyche, is it's it's really interesting to read. There's a lot going on that kind of doesn't really get addressed, or doesn't get wrapped up, I guess I should say, because everything gets addressed. But, like the stuff with Jose Delgado learning to walk again, he is actually now being controlled by Lex Luthor. And that's something that gets affected later. Brainiac and Lex Luthor working together. Again, it's something that gets addressed later. Lex Luthor and inner gangs like Gang War. Again, happens later. So this story is definitely setting up a lot of stuff that's happening, that's going to be happening later in the Superman run. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But it did make this video kind of hard to script, trying to remember what concluded in the story and what didn't. But yeah, there's a lot of really cool stuff going on. All of the side characters in this Superman comic feel super fleshed out, which is really cool. Like, you really do get a sense, Jimmy Olsen is Jimmy Olsen, Lois Lane. It's cool. I like all the side characters. And then I do want to talk for a minute about a little bit more about the actual story. So, yeah, obviously you have Gangbuster starting to show up around the end of the first part of this story. And now I remember what I wanted to talk about. So Gangbuster himself is actually the most interesting part of Clark Kent's psyche, because Superman, Clark Kent, he doesn't know that he's Gangbuster. And that's what makes him that's what scares Clark so bad, is that it's not like when he's pretending to be Superman, where he's fully in control, he fully knows what's going on. It's basically like a split personality, but like he has no idea what's happening. He thinks he's asleep most of the time, asleep or unconscious. Clark has no idea that he's Gangbuster, and that's what scares him so much. That's why he exiles himself, which I also really like. I like that Superman is so scared of what he's becoming that he decides to leave Earth. And yeah, and Gangbuster, and the idea of having him be Gangbuster, a vigilante that Superman knew about. And throughout the story we see that, yeah, Superman is that people at first don't disagree with Gangbuster's methods, which again adds to the toll on Superman. Like, hey, why? Like, people, are telling him at the end of the first issue, somebody says, hey, why didn't you just kill Brainiac? Like, it would have worked out better for everyone if you did. But that's just not who Superman is. That's not how he works. And that's what I really like about this story. It takes what was already a really well done story in the Supergirl saga of having him kill his villains, and really showing him dealing with the psychic toll that takes on him. And as a part of that, it's really cool seeing him again at the end of the story be so horrified with himself that he feels he has no other choice but to exile himself into deep space. And that's an era of Superman stories that look really good. That the Superman exile period. And yeah. And one thing that I do like about this story is at the end of the final issue, we get a little note from, who's it from? I think it's from the editor. Yeah, it's from either the editor or it's from Jerry Ordway, giving credit for the story. I'm actually just going to read this little excerpt. As stated on the first page of this issue, all of us here on the two Superman titles would like to extend a hail and hearty thanks to John Byrne for setting up and helping to plan some of the directions these books have been taken over the last 5 or 6 months. Before John's untimely departure from the Superman comics, much of the personality crisis story plotline had been outlined. Subsequently, Jerry Ordway and Roger Stern fleshed out and fully realized this chapter of the Man of Steel's adventures. Thanks again, John Byrne. Good luck with West Coast Avengers and She-Hulk. Say hi for us over there. And I really like that, giving credit. I like that they gave just a little bit of credit to John Byrne for helping to come up with the actual story, which is just kind of a cool thing to do. I like that. Overall, this is a really good story. Almost every issue of this Superman series, this Superman run is like super easy to find. I'd highly, highly, highly recommend it. Really, really good story. A bit of a slower burn. Every issue is good, but it feels like it takes a second for it to like truly start compounding, and that's perfectly fine. The issues before it really gets going are still really good. But yeah, I definitely highly recommend getting your own copy of this story. It's a solid one. This whole run of Superman so far has actually been really good, and it's been a lot of fun to read. But yeah, I would say I very highly recommend it. And yeah, overall, I think that's really all I've got. But yeah, good story, good Superman character study, I suppose. But yeah, that's really all I got. So we'll cut it here, and yeah. So yeah, I'm just another guy named James. I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.